Deconstructing psyops, propaganda, and mainstream media garbage. Pelle NEROTH Taylor on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome to the 11th of September, 2024. Well, 11th of September is one of about 3 dates that I can remember. As that joke goes, I remember John Lennon's assassination, and I remember, that, and 9/11, and one or two other things of which I can't think of now, but I went through in my head a couple of years ago, which were the all-important events. I was sitting by my computer in my flat writing an article, and and you saw that apparently a light plane had hit the World Trade Center, and then the story unfolded, as we all know, in the next couple of hours. So today is going to be 9/11 day, but we're also going to talk about the Trump-Kamala Harris debate, which took place last night. The candidates, incidentally, will both be paying tribute to the 9/11 events, and in their various ways going to some of the impact sites. We've got with us Jason Robertson to talk about that. We had him on yesterday. That was the pre-match analysis. We're going to have a post-match analysis, and we'll be asking him, do you remember 9/11? As I'm sure he will remember, and maybe we can, but it's a pretty short chat we'll have with him. We've got Ian Proud, a former UK diplomat. You can find him at prouddiplomat.com. There are things happening in Ukraine with David Lammy, the newly minted British Foreign Secretary, and Antony Blinken in Kiev. Are they going to read the last rites, or are they going to escalate? Well, that's the eternal question, and Ian's going to tell us about that. He's also going to tell us about BRICS and Turkey's application to join. Turkey is, of course, the second most important NATO member, probably head maybe even of Britain, with second largest army, I think, after the US. Pivotal role in the Middle East. Their decision to join BRICS shows that multipolarity grinds on, even as we in the Atlantic world are obsessing about our own problems. And Ian's going to be telling us about the huge significance of that event, which sometimes gets obscured now that we are so election focused. And we've got Piers Robertson to talk to us about 9/11. He's actually got, he is one of the top UK scholars on 9/11, and he laments the fact that so-called serious international relations analysts don't incorporate 9/11 understanding into their analysis of the world. And I really think you do need to do that. If it was a false flag or an event meant self-planned event, a self-attack meant to actuate a large-scale war, well, then maybe they might do that sort of thing again. I mean, we mustn't be like sort of zebras, out there in savannah. The lion takes one of the zebras, and after a few minutes commotion, the zebras go back to grazing. This is the whole point about learning about these events. I mean, there is a lot of conspiracies out there, I know, but if it's not, we can't afford not to trace down the perpetrators, because if they get away with it, they'll get away with it again. False flag, as said, is one of my main concerns between now and November that might upset an orderly election in the US. And a lot of us, of course, are hoping for Trump. Anyway, we're going to talk about the Kamala Harris. The UK press, the European press, of course, is completely in the tank for Kamala. And let's say the Times, which is, the paper of the British establishment, shows how left-wing the centrist dads, the people running both on the Tory and the Labour side, are basically slightly to the left of the US Democrats. So they completely demolished Trump, and they said, this was a man who allowed himself be waylaid by Kamala's attacks and lost a chance to strike home in his main points. Whereas Kamala Harris, unfortunately, if you look to more objective media, you'll realize that she had the ABC News completely on her side. The two moderators were fact-checked Trump all the time, and they didn't fact-check Kamala once. But thanks to doughty citizen journalists on X and people like Jason Robertson, who'll come on in just a second, we know that she was telling a porky or five. And what's I think is rather significant is that David Muir and his co-host, whose name just escapes me, well, they're ABC, but who runs ABC, who's head of the news division? Somebody called Diana Wallen, who I think is Kamala Harris's best friend. And of course, Kamala Harris, at the top of ABC, there's the Disney Corporation, which of course is possibly the most woke organization in the universe. So they like all that Kamala stuff. So always look at the owners of these corporations. That's something we ought to know. There ought to be a little stamp in people's legacy journalists' heads, or at least a badge or something, so that we know what we're getting when they interview. So anyway, we're going to bring on Jason Robertson after a very quick break, and we're going to have our post-match analysis of the rest of that debate after a very quick break.
Today's News Talk Radio.
Come on, let the man talk.
We never censor our hosts.
Good. Now, talk.
Uncensored news.
On today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle and NEROTH Taylor Show. We've got Jason Robertson, who's the co-founder of the American Tribune network of properties. You can check him out on www.theamericantribune.com or theamericantribune.news, which I actually was reading until late last night on Pizzagate, but we won't go into Pizzagate right now. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Hey, Pelle, thanks for having me on again. This is a solemn day for America. So it's.
What do you reckon? What's the first thing you'll tell a foreign journalist like myself who asks you, how did it go? What were your first thoughts about the debate?
It went. I thought criticism of Trump for missing some of his high points is fair. I don't think the debate moved the needle for either person. I think if you look at America, the electorate, 30 or 40% are going to vote for Trump, 30 or 40% are going to vote for Kamala, and you have that middle 20 to 30% that you're going to sway. I don't think Trump reinforced the message he did in his closing enough across the whole debate. Like, hey, they've been destroying the country for 4 years, stuff costs too much, inflation's out of control. I think he got a little sidetracked in some of the attacks about rally size, that kind of thing. Conversely, Kamala offered nothing to the center people who are looking around and their groceries cost 30% more. And she's talking about Charlottesville and things from years ago. So I think Team Kamala's got to be ecstatic today because she had a lot more to lose than Trump did. I mean, Trump's kind of a known commodity. And I don't think it's going to move the polls much one way or the other. But like I say, I think criticism of Trump for not hitting the key points he needed and getting sidetracked is fair.
Well, you were saying, weren't you, that what Trump should be doing is get her to speak spontaneously. And we know that she just produces word salads and, nothing but strings of cliches when she's taken off message, whereas she's quite an effective communicator when she's got her ready talking points. Meanwhile, Trump should calm down, but they managed to bait him and get him off his talking points. So in a way, their strategists were successful at that. They goaded him with lies, basically. The Charlottesville story, and then what do you think of the ABC moderators? I mean, do you think that Trump should have said, well, that's how media work and I should have accounted for it? Or do you think that they were outrageous or what?
I think they were outrageous. And I think for people that don't follow politics and they see the moderators on ABC continuing to push back on Trump and push back on Trump, and then Kamala says something and they just let it go. I mean, the ABC moderators, the key for Trump was to get her off script, and the moderators, anytime there was a risk of that, they would jump in and stop it and redirect the questions. And it was Trump, why are you so awful? And then it would be Kamala, why do you think Trump is so awful? So she was just able to regurgitate a lot of points. So she escaped pretty well. I think the average American watching it's like, wow, is this 3-on-1? Why are they not fact checking Kamala? Why are they not pushing back on her? Even on the question, he made a great point about she was in Ukraine with Russian representatives and Zelensky 3 days before he invaded, and then they invade. And they're like, oh, did you meet with Russians? And they let her just like skate over the question, not answer it. But I think a lot of Americans watching are like, wait a second, that really happened, didn't it? And so, yeah, the moderators certainly played to her advantage. And I think Kamala knows, even with that, she didn't move the needle enough because her campaign is looking for another debate now. So I think they're thankful she was able to stay on script. She did a really nice job, like delivering her message. And I mean, everything was just, here's my little 3-minute speech on this, my 2-minute speech on this, and yeah, so it was definitely 3-on-1. I don't think Trump picked up a lot of votes. I don't think he lost a lot of votes. But I think that puts Kamala in a spot because I think the real polling has Kamala down. You and I will never see that until Election Day.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, even the New York Times poll had her 1% behind Trump. And that translates as a definite loss in the electoral roll. So ABC let Harris get away with the Charlottesville hoax, the bloodbath hoax, the police officers dying on January 6th hoax. And then they fact-checked Trump on animals in Ohio. And apparently those enterprising journalists over at the Federalists found a police audio where four Haitians or something were walking around with four geese or ducks or whatever it was. I can't remember.
Right.
Was it holding them and walking off to their culinary fate, apparently, So that story actually checks out. So the story they said was fake news, which is making the headlines. People remember that kind of detailed stuff. And then, the Charlottesville hoax, which was debunked even by Snopes, which is a very left-leaning. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it was fascinating because they got sidetracked about the animals, and it just shows how awful journalism is in America. We called the city manager, and he said he has no reports. When everybody can see the videos, everybody can hear the audio calls. There's numerous accounts, thank God for Twitter, that are just sharing some of these police reports, filings, the city council meeting, and it's a masterclass too in how they do media manipulation, because there was a story about a lady eating a cat, their neighbor's cat. She wasn't Haitian, and it was in a different town, and they're using that to say, see, that lady wasn't from this town they're referring to, and she's not Haitian, so the story's debunked. When it's like they're not addressing the police reports, the people speaking at city council meetings, any of those facts, that just a 10-minute search on the internet you can find.
Well, exactly. So what they do is if you're not, if you don't have a great memory, you might get one or two details wrong, but the essence of what you're saying is right, and that's Trump all the time. I think I get details wrong, and then they'll pick on your detail and omit the fact that you got the gist of the argument right, and that's not. I did Karl Popper at university. You should always attack your opponent on his strongest argument. Otherwise, you haven't really defeated him. Otherwise, it's just kind of counter propaganda. Did Trump? Sorry, over to you.
I was going to say, it's interesting you say that, because a preview, I think next week we're on talking Pizzagate. That's exactly what they did with Pizzagate. They debunked Comet Pizza, but the underlying accusations they didn't even touch. And they say, oh, this is debunked and it's nothing. And they are right. Comet Pizza wasn't involved, it appears, but they didn't debunk any of the underlying claims.
I was reading that Garrell Cooper article that you linked to, and he wrote about that. And it's interesting how this 4chan or QAnon or whatever conspiracy theory. I think sometimes, they did come out with a lot of nonsense, but I sometimes wonder if the CIA inserts people into those chat rooms and comes out with crazy ideas, and then that debunks so it's like we know that FBI maybe infiltrates riots and things like that, and happened in the UK where the police infiltrated the riots, and they do the worst stuff. They're agent provocateur. Well, you have digital agent provocateur who give conspiracy theories a bad name, by coming out with crazy stuff, and then that's debunked, and then that's kind of stands for everything. Oh, they're crazy, they come up with crazy ideas. It could be just some CIA guy sitting there, coming up with crazy ideas about Pizzagate. So
100%.
Anyway, do you think? Well, did Trump? I read some of the summaries. I was enjoying my sweet beauty sleep last night, but saying that he did actually. His summary was a bit better, and he was quite effective when he said, when Democrats pushed the idea that Trump was a threat to democracy, he flipped the script, saying that the Democrats had staged a palace coup against Biden by coronating Kamala as a nominee, and of course they hadn't had the primaries, and of course there was this assassination attempt looming. Did they talk about that assassination attempt? Anyone?
No, the assassination attempt didn't come up. The Trump's closing was phenomenal. And if he would have kept that messaging throughout the debate, it was, these guys are saying they're going to do all this stuff, but they haven't done any in the last 4 years. He did, I think, win the battle of the sound bites, where at one point he talked about them sending Joe Biden to pasture and you just got installed, but you're calling me a threat to democracy. The visuals when he talked about his persecution, and Kamala's sitting over there looking all smug when he's talking about political persecution. So Trump, I think as videos get clipped and circulated around the internet, he will win the soundbite battle. I just wish from a consistency standpoint, like she joked about people leaving his rally early, and then he got sidetracked on that. And she was really effective at that, like poking the bear. Then he chases it because he only got 2 minutes to respond. So if she can kill 45 seconds of it with him talking about something he doesn't need to, it was a less effective message. But I think in the next debate, if you just had CNN level bias, like in the Biden-Trump debate, Trump would have done phenomenal. But unfortunately, and like I say, even the average person, if you see the middle of the road voters, all the interviews are like, yeah, that was 3-on-1. I mean, everybody's pretty clear with that.
Jason, well, I mean, ABC are worried about their White House press pass will be withdrawn, apparently. But we'll see if they'll consent to another debate. And of course, you'll be on that. Just a last thing. Do you remember we're going to have a 9/11 themed day? Do you remember 9/11? Of course you do. But where were you? And just a quick 30-second account of your memories of that day.
9/11, I was working in a corporate office, and I heard somebody say a plane hit the tower, and I went into the break room where everybody was gathered just as the second plane hit. It was one of the most transformational things. And you're going to go through all the stuff. Like, we still don't have the answers. We still don't have how it happened. Patriot Act came out of 9/11, which was one of the worst legislation ever in America. But the one thing I think that 9/11 that people don't talk about is the United States is never attacked. And all around the world, people's worldviews, if you're in the Middle East, there's a war every other day. But this was the first attack on American soil in most people's lifetimes. And that had such a transformational effect. And the fear it produced that the government leveraged to put all this mass surveillance in place was just, it was tragic for the American lives lost, but it was in the long term more tragic for the civil liberties that we lost.
It created the surveillance state and the fear-based media and the dishonest media. I think the dishonest media took off after 9/11 and the last 25 years. We'll argue about that another time. Jason Robertson, thank you so much. Check him out on www.americantribune.com, and we'll have him on very soon. Thank you so much, sir. And we're going to go over to our next guest, a diplomat from the UK, and we're going to talk about events in Ukraine and in the BRICS countries after the break.
Are we on the air?
Am I on the air?
You're on the air?
On the air 24/7. Your news talk giant, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle and NEROTH Taylor Show on 9/11, or the 23rd anniversary of that fateful day. Well, one of the things that our useless media didn't talk about, which I thought was a highlight for me in the Trump-Biden debate, was Trump saying he's going to end this stupid war in Ukraine, and he might end it before he gets inaugurated even. I don't know how he's going to do that, but it's a very strong statement, and it didn't appear in the headlines that I saw, even though it might have been the most important statement of the night. Well, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about BRICS and Turkey, which is another huge story, but doesn't attract the headline writers quite so much either. But we've got Ian Proud with us, a returning guest, a friend, a former member of Her Majesty's Diplomatic Service, posted to the British Embassy in Moscow from 2014 to 2019. He was in Moscow. He's a chair of the Russia Crisis Committee and played a pivotal role in response to the Salisbury nerve agent attack of March 9, 2018. Director of the Diplomatic Academy for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and vice chairman of the board of the Anglo-American School of Moscow. And he blogs at prouddiplomat.com, which is a great little site. And he's written a book about his experiences in Moscow. Welcome to the show, Ian.
Thanks, Pelle. It's nice to see you again. It's been a while.
Great to see you. It has indeed. You were just saying in the break there that you actually, we're talking about 9/11. You were actually at the Pentagon just before 9/11. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, the first thing I did was to email friends in the Pentagon that I'd met days before. I'd been over for visits to talk about Indonesia. I've been to the Pentagon. I've been to Langley, Foggy Bottom, obviously, Fort Bowling. Given the call up at Cornell University in New York State. And literally the night of 9/10, I flew back, arrived into Heathrow the morning of 9/11, and went into the Foreign Office in King Charles Street, just drinking lots of coffee to kind of stay awake after the red-eye flight. And the first thing that we knew that it had happened was that our computers went down in the Foreign Office, and there's a tannoy announcement saying there'd been an issue in New York, and that's the first we'd heard. And so we flick on the TVs in time, sadly, to see the second jet go into the other tower. So, but yeah, the first thought was to kind of reach out to the friends in the Pentagon that I met, and thankfully they were all safe, and God bless all those poor souls who perished in that most horrendous terrorist attack. Frankly, we all
I'm
remember them
tempted
all
to
today.
ask you what about UK policy after, but no, I suspect we're going to be talking for another hour, and we don't get into the gist of what's happening today. But let's say, in a very brief way, could you just say what the result was? I mean, I remember the Iraq War and all that, but any comments you'd like to make on the post 9/11 era?
Sadly, I was head of the Indonesia department at the time, which was the largest Muslim country, Muslim population country in the world at that time. I think possibly still is. And I played a very, very marginal role in looking at the intelligence dossier after 9/11, just because I was working on a sort of high sort of Muslim population country. This was the version before Alistair Campbell sexed it up. I don't know if you remember that story about sexing up the intelligence dossier to justify. So I actually saw that dossier before it got sexed up by Alistair Campbell, and it was absolutely clear from that dossier that obviously kind of Al Qaeda had been hosted in Afghanistan, or the terrible Taliban rule. There's really nothing at all really to link it to Iraq, and of course Chilcot, since we found out that inquiry that the whole thing was a completely illegal hoax to kind of start a war in Iraq, but. Absolutely, there's a sort of direct line of sight to.
Well, okay, I mean we've got a whole generation, maybe even two generations have grown up since 9/11. So just give us a very, very quick summary of what the sexing up of the dossier consisted.
So essentially, the UK side, MI6, others, on the American side, because we share all this information. We gathered. We had a UK dossier of all the intelligence available, just reviewing, how this had happened. The links, of the perpetrators, and that showed a very clear link to Afghanistan, obviously, being harbored by the Taliban regime, training camps in Afghanistan, where the kind of some of the people who have been on the flights have been training out there, and that justified then the NATO kind of involvement in Afghanistan, which then actually went on way too long. But let's not talk about that. But because Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, his biggest priority in that moment was to show the US that the UK was the most fervent supporter of the US in terms of how the US responded, to that terrible, tragedy. So there's this determination to do everything kind of support the US, and it's clear the US wanted to kind of go in hard, and they were keen, even though there wasn't much evidence to kind of going on Iraq too, even though all the evidence was pointing to Afghanistan, and the direct communications, and for Tony Blair, number 10 down issues, a guy called Alistair Campbell, who's still making millions now writing diaries about his amazing performances apparently, but he basically encouraged the head of the sort of joint intelligence committee to kind of glamorize the intelligence dossier, to kind of make it seem like there was a much stronger link to Iraq than was actually the case. So, and this is what in his words, he said, sexing up the dossier. And that's, in the UK, maybe not in the US and Australia, in the UK, that is a very, very kind of famous term, sexing up with this dossier. And so that was really a pretext for the UK to kind of follow the Americans into Iraq.
And they just go get into the news in a sec. I mean, this dossier, I mean, it's weighed him down forever. I mean, his name has been attached to that. So when he was complaining about people exercising their free speech about immigration the other day, and he was saying, put these people in jail. Well, people are saying, you should talk, Alistair Campbell. How many Muslims did people being jailed for flying the Union Jack in front of Muslim mosques and so on in northern towns. Well, I mean, it didn't actually harm anyone, might have insulted a couple of people. But I mean, this double standards idiot, how many Muslims did his dossier contribute to the death of, So he's the guy to talk, when he's protecting the tender feelings of Muslims.
He's still making a living. It's shocking that he's still making a living from being this communications expert. It's quite amazing. But there you go, tragic.
Ian, we're just going to go into the news, and I think we're going to go head straight to the BRICS issue after the break. This is the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show on TNT News Talk, and we'll be back after the news.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Today's News Talk.
News and information.
Today's News Talk.
TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle and Taylor Show. Well, multipolarity grinds on, even as we are completely obsessed with the daily news cycle. And a huge development, I think, which Ian, on your blog, you have drawn attention to, is a senior NATO member Turkey's decision to join BRICS. Can you tell us that story and why it's important?
Well, yeah, I mean, Turkey's been trying, for years, decades, to kind of join the European Union, and it's very clear that the European Union doesn't really want Turkey to join. It's just some holy Muslim countries. So I keep talking about sort of that, but that does seem to be, prejudice does seem to kind of play a big role in this kind of resistance, packaged up as kind of human rights and that sort of thing. And I think actually, sort of BRICS in the past 2 years has kind of taken off. It's been on this kind of slow burn trajectory really for the past decade, actually, since the start of the Ukraine crisis. All these kind of countries feeling sort of increasingly kind of concerned about the US hegemony and saying, well, actually, maybe a group where we only focus on economics is a good thing. Like even Saudi Arabia and Iran are sort of talking about having some sort of approachment, which would have been unimaginable 2 years ago, brokered through kind of BRICS grouping and so on. And I think Turkey said, well, sort of, we're never going to join the EU, so we're just kind of right in the ring with this group. And actually, by the end of this decade of BRICS, if it keeps going like it is, 30 countries, additional countries want to join it. Is originally just 5: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It could be more than half the world's population in this one grouping. It could be a very, very powerful, both economic but also kind of political grouping, which would then genuinely create more than one poles of power, globally. And I think that's already happening.
Well, and you write in your blog post that a core aim was to reduce dependence on the US dollar for global trade and therefore foreign exchange reserves. Russia's and China's shift to trading oil and yuan, Saudi Arabia's abandonment of the petrodollar pact, and the UAE and India's agreement to change on trading in rupees are good examples of this, of de-dollarization. So America has a $35 trillion debt, apparently the interest on that debt is bigger than the annual defense budget. I don't think they even talked about it in yesterday's pseudo debate. America's going to come crashing down if the world de-dollarizes. So it's a kind of slow strangulation of the Atlantic world that's going on here, isn't there?
Well, yeah, because I mean, the less people use dollars, the less demand there is for dollars. The weaker it becomes. That forces interest rates, on borrowing up, and that makes debt harder to service. I mean, that's the point. It's actually the long-term impact on interest rates from there being much lower global demand for the dollar. And I think that's nobody's really talking about that. But I mean, and we're talking long-term. We're not tomorrow, not even next year, a decade down the track. Possibly. But that is the ticking time bomb here of the US federal debt and their ability to service it if there's a slow, inexorable kind of rise in the cost of borrowing for the US.
Well, actually, let's. I mean, one of my fears, this Thucydides trap argument that this is 2,500-year argument that when countries are declining and there's another power rising, you hit the rising power before it becomes too powerful. And that has been applied to Sparta versus Athens, Britain versus Germany in World War I, where Britain was the declining power, Germany was the rising power, and now China versus the US. Apparently, the Chinese are studying World War I and how it started, the rivalry between Germany and Britain, because they don't want the Americans to attack them before they become too powerful. So that leads me to the point, I mean, whether we'll have a war in the Middle East or Russia, because the West doesn't want, it sees hegemony slipping away and wants to strike before it's too late. And that leads us to this, what's going on in Kiev at the moment, where the Ukrainians have been leaking to the Daily Telegraph. It's their main story today that Biden might finally authorize deep-range strikes of missiles. And the Russians have long said this is a red line. And do you think it's going to happen? And just talk us through some of those issues.
Well, I mean, there is a war happening right now, right? It's been happening for 3 years. Russia is a very reciprocal country, and if they say they'll respond in a certain way, they almost always do. And if the risk of allowing so longer-range strikes is for Zelensky, he wants to start targeting Russian cities. I think he said something like, the fear of war must be bigger than the fear of Putin. And I think that's actually a quote he said quite recently. What that means is the same sort of civilian casualties that have been happening in Ukrainian cities since the war started. If that's happening with Western weapons, then the Russians will respond against the West. And for me, that is, having studied the Russians for well over a decade, that is absolutely clear. So, the US will need to be quite careful with this. Not least as actually we're running out of time for the election, right? I mean, why go now? I mean, it's not really going to tip the balance of the war in favor of Kiev. There's now pushback in Kursk, for example, that's already falling away from Ukraine's grasp. What's the end game here? This is only escalatory, but not in a way actually that would help Kiev. That's the really bizarre thing about it. Zelensky just wants to pull the West into a wider war against Russia, and we should absolutely avoid that.
We should absolutely avoid war, but I mean, there are forces in the West who might want, if Trump looks at, I mean, he said, one of the most important things he said in yesterday's debate is, I'm going to end the war in Ukraine, and he might even end it before the inauguration. I don't know how he managed to do that, but anyway, he said it. And obviously there are hawks in the West who might want to precipitate that or avoid that, obviate that, whatever, by starting a war, and that might, change the election calculus, because the Democrats might suddenly be the war party, and we've all got to join the war party, and everyone else is a traitor. That's a standard thing. Politicians start wars because Maybe
the US will declare martial law and the elections will be cancelled.
Right, I don't know. Yeah.
But yeah, possibly. I mean, I don't personally see it happening, and pray God that it doesn't happen. But I think it'd be a pretty crazy gamble by Biden to do that. I think, as has happened recently, there'll be some sort of. I mean, Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, just last week said no one missile is going to change the battlefield realities for Ukraine. So I don't see Biden taking a seismic shift away from that policy position, which Austin sort of pointed out. While a token $250 million.
They're obviously under huge pressure from the Brits and the Ukrainians, because the Brits have been saying that in their media for a long time, and the Americans have been coming up with excuses like, it won't make a difference anyway, and we don't have enough, and the range isn't enough, and lots of things. And I think Blinken might be on board with escalation, but the Pentagon isn't, and I don't know who has the final say. I mean, we don't know if Biden is compos mentis enough to understand everything that's going on. So who's making the decisions on these really crucial issues?
It slightly reminds you of the time when Cheryenko was in charge of the Soviet Union, doesn't it?
Yeah. God, dangerous times. Yeah. It's And okay, Ian, I'm afraid we've got to wind up there. Great to talk to you. Check Ian out on his blog, Proud Diplomat, and for excellent analysis. And we've got to have you on again very soon. Thanks a lot, Ian. Great to see you again.
All the best.
Absolutely.
Bye for now.
Take care. All the best. And we're going to go. We're going to have a quick break, and then we're going to talk about 9/11 for the next 20 minutes with Piers Robertson, who's one of the world's, at least the UK's, leading experts on propaganda, and he has an excellent website on 9/11. We'll be back after the break to talk about.
My name's Stacy. I'm 57, and I was adopted in 2020.
We were adopted in 2019,
and we were adopted in 2021.
We had a house, and it sounds crazy, but it wasn't a home. The one thing that Jake and Emma brought is it became a home.
When I met Dakota, he had just turned 14.
You weren't there for the first this and the first that. I missed the first words, but we got a lot of other firsts.
Watching her say, oh my God, I cannot believe I got my license. And she's like, I passed. And I'm like, girl.
See them grow. It is.
They chose to love us. They didn't have to. They chose us. Family.
You and you.
Kids in the middle. What I thought was a complete life was nowhere near complete, but it is now.
Learn about adopting a teen from foster care. You can't imagine the reward. Visit adoptuskids.org.
My dad was a farmer. The guy was bigger than life. He wasn't someone that liked to show his emotion or liked to show when he was struggling, but we all struggle. I want to show emotion to my kids. It's something that brings me so much joy. And I want them to see me working through things. Allow your kids to know that it's okay to struggle, that even dad doesn't know the answer sometimes, but we're going to figure it out together.
Deconstructing psyops, propaganda, and mainstream media garbage. Pelle NEROTH Taylor on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show. We've got the brilliant Piers Robertson with us, who's the co-director for the Organisation for Propaganda Studies and convener of the Working Group on Syria Media and Propaganda, associated with associate researcher with Working Group of Propaganda and the 9/11 Global War on Terror, member of the Pender and Berlin Group 21, and researches and writes on propaganda, conflict, and media, and was a chair and professor in politics, society, and political journalism at the University of Sheffield until 2019. And you should check out this excellent 9/11 website on ic911.org. That's ic911.org. Welcome to the show, Piers.
Hi, it's good to be with you.
Great. Unsurprisingly, we're going to have a little 9/11 chat, because you wrote an excellent essay on the comparisons between the 9/11 event and the whole COVID event, the way these events are kind of created and they become never let a good crisis go to waste. They're sort of almost like planned events to increase the power of the state. These are kind of false flag events designed to create fear in people's minds and then push for an extension of the power of the deep state. But before we talk about the essay that you wrote on that website that I just mentioned, what were you doing on 9/11 itself? Do you remember?
Well, no, I remember I was actually, as it were, coming off a lunch break at home. I think I'd been watching Neighbours at the time after the 1 o'clock news, and it cut in right at the end. I think it was an image of one of the towers with black smoke pouring out of it. I immediately thought it looked like some kind of volcano, I thought. And then it became clear, and then I watched for the remainder of the day until my partner at the time came home. 9/11 is September 11th is in fact my birthday, so that was my birthday. Is today,
wow.
Obviously.
Oh, happy birthday! Right.
Thank you. So, so that's what I was doing, and a little bit of alarm initially because one of my brothers was in New York at the time. He's working for an architectural firm and still does, and he was in New York. So there was some concern about making sure he was okay, but I think that was established fairly quickly. So that was my personal remembering exactly where I was and what I was doing.
And in a way, 9/11, of course, has been part of your life. I mean, ever since, in a way, and it's accelerated in the last couple of years with your work on it. So it was a determinative event in your life, and who could have guessed, sort of thing.
Yes.
What you wrote an essay on 9/11. One of the things that annoys me about 9/11 is, first of all, if 9/11 was the alternative truth, that it was an inside job or something, certainly not this just Al-Qaeda flying into the towers, but some kind of deep state job, we must act as if we must have the courage, we in the alternative community, because they might do it again, right? So we can't just see it as a historical event, but a historical event that gives us warning for something to happen in the future. We can't be like sort of, zebras with an attention span of 3 seconds. So when the lion takes another zebra, we go back to grazing and carrying on our normal lives. We must assume that it's a warning that they might do this sort of thing again. And that's why I've been warning about false flags in Ukraine since forever. Although it doesn't seem to be happening at the moment, or something, the Israelis might be doing something, or the American deep state. But you, of course, in your essay that you put out on that website, argues that we did have something, and that was COVID. That was a follow-up. So can you just tell us a little bit about the comparisons there? And the other thing that struck me about that was you had a better description of who might these perpetrators be inside the US deep state than any of the other stuff that I've read on 9/11. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit as well.
Well, for sure. And this is a paper that I co-authored with Kevin Ryan, who's also in the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And Kevin Ryan has for a long time been part of the research community on 9/11 and was a whistleblower himself initially from a company who was testing some of the steel and so on. And the paper we wrote was really sort of picking up on this point that, we do have these big events which occur, and they become extremely useful for political actors to push forward agendas. Now, sometimes this might be just pure opportunism on the part of political actors. Something happens, they've got a crisis, don't let it go to waste, and they push forward on agendas and so on. And the point, of course, and this is where we're drawing upon Peter Dale Scott's structural deep event concept, is that sometimes actors, they're not just sort of, exploiting the opportunity, they're also involved in enabling and instigating that event to occur. And the paper we wrote, which was titled The Plausibility Probe of 9/11 and COVID-19 as Structural Deep Events, is freely available, by the way, we should put it in the show links, was that if we look at various criteria across both of these cases, we see that there are indications of a pattern there. If we look at, for example, the presence of structural agendas which are there, which have a transformative effect on society. So with 9/11, it's the global war on terror principally. COVID-19, you had the Great Reset. You also had the biosecurity agenda. When you have those features running alongside a set of other features or criteria, such as rapid reaction to events, immediately blaming the perpetrator without a proper investigation, as is what happened with 9/11. When you have, and this is a key point, when you have manipulation of science going on in order to maintain a false perception of what has happened, and with 9/11, this was very clear with the destruction of the buildings in New York and essentially the corruption of the NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, investigation of those tower collapses. And that's very well documented now that those investigations were corrupted. With COVID-19, we had a corruption of science in terms of the exaggeration of deaths and so on, and many questions now about the nature of what was actually spreading in the early months of the COVID-19 event. Deliberate corruption of science in order to maintain a misperception on the part of the public of what's going on. Then other indicators, widespread propaganda, promotion of official narratives, and then very aggressive suppression of dissent. Those features we saw very clearly with both COVID-19 and 9/11. And then the final feature we pick out from the structural deep event concept is the evidence of foreknowledge. And of course, with 9/11, for example, you had the insider trading, which is now well established. It was going on, which indicates that people within the US sort of power structure were aware that it was about to happen. With COVID-19, there are lots of examples. For example, Event 201, the planning exercise held in October, but also the actions of authorities and also, for example, the World Health Organization, which is really far ahead of the curve in terms of any demonstrable global crisis. All those actions indicated foreknowledge. And we argue when you put all of these elements together, you start to see a picture which essentially provides a lot of support for the working hypothesis, which is that they are instigated structural deep events. These are events which are being, in some shape or form, enabled or instigated and then used deceptively as a form of propaganda in order to mobilize populations to, in the case of 9/11, support the global war on terror. Extensive conflicts across the international system. With COVID-19, we're slightly more cautious on the agendas which were being pushed, but we say that they're running in parallel, and these are things which really need a lot more research. But COVID-19, as famously was said by Klaus Schwab, this is a great opportunity to reset society and so on. And you have in these cases essentially people being mobilized in that fear of a virus to support. For example, central bank digital currency is an example which people highlight. Mandated injections, mRNA technology being used in the injections, all of those, well, that's all part of the biosecurity agenda. All of that was something, are policies which could be pushed for or promoted in the context of this widespread fear of the virus, just as the global war on terror and the invasion and attack on countries which had no plausible link with the official claims about 9/11. They could build public support for invading and attacking those countries. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. And that does really segue into where we are now in the international system. Again, with potentially war against Iran. And so what we argue is that when you sort of apply these criteria, which reflect a conceptual framework, you start to see more clearly, and you're more able to actually sort of identify evidence. It tells you where to look, in a sense, in terms of if this is a structural deep event being instigated, you're likely to see this. And if you find evidence of that, then it's supporting the hypothesis. So it provides you a very systematic and empirical way of looking at these big events and then addressing the question, could these actually be instigated and being manipulated by elites? And so that's essentially what we do in the paper. And I think we do finish it off by saying, well, this kind of framework should be used and applied to, for example, the JFK assassination. And then we can start to get a better handle on how much elite actors are actually using these kinds of propaganda of the deed in order to push forward agendas. And I guess my final comment on it is this is a way of trying to combat the immediate charge of this is just conspiracism. This is just ill thought out, illogical, unevidenced claims about these events. But if you apply these frameworks, the framework we developed and concepts such as a structural deep event, and then go about looking for the empirical evidence, you can actually go about this in a rational way, where you can say, well, look, the bottom line is there is evidence there, and we need to take this seriously. And then with the hope, as you hinted at, that sort of if people can start to see and understand these events more clearly, then there's perhaps a little bit more opportunity we have as populations to actually push back against such actions.
And maybe see the warning sign of the next one. Right? It's interesting. I mean, yes. What you're doing is good political science. You're gathering the evidence, formulating a theory that will fit with the evidence, and then using that theory to apply to other events that we hadn't thought of before. But of course, it goes against a lot of the political science that's out there already. I mean, it's a game changer or a gestalt shift or whatever you want to call it. And of course, everyone is wedded to the old model. I mean, there's very little written in the IR literature about 9/11, and these people are very close-minded. I mean, hardly any historians write about it. Any of the so-called serious historians. I mean, I think a generation is going to shift out and change their minds. I mean, there's nothing that says we have to trust the Guardian, we have to trust the Times, we have to trust the professor of history at Oxford. His people make up their own mind. X is the new town hall, or So I'm just hoping. What annoys me is people getting away with doing these things, and then they're being enabled by establishment elites who don't write about it, and call people like yourself. I mean, you've left Sheffield now, but you're doing much better work now than you were doing at Sheffield, I think, if I may say so.
Well, I mean, I continue working. Obviously, I work with a number of organizations, and primarily with International Center for 9/11 Justice as their research director now. But I still publish in academic outlets. I would probably be best described as an independent academic, but I still carry on working and communicating with colleagues who are in the establishment, and I'm involved in a variety of activities where you have that overlap. And everyone is aware, everyone who knows the truth about 9/11, for example, within the academy, are very conscious that if I say anything about this, I'm going to get smeared, I'm going to get bullied, harassed by colleagues, and so on. And so there's these powerful sort of, as it were, control mechanisms in place which really disincentivize academics from looking at these issues. But I've established myself as an academic over many years and published lots and so on. And, I think it's my responsibility to sort of do the work objectively and then communicate with my colleagues and say, well, this is what we've got. And, you can either ignore it or put your head in the sand. And as you pointed out very eloquently, the danger of that is that we just allow it to happen again. Or we accept our role as academics who have a responsibility to truth and to objective research and open research. And we confront these very difficult issues. And I guess one of the things I'll do going forward in the coming years is I will engage and continue to engage with my colleagues who are still in the academy. Some I know are fully aware of 9/11 but won't speak about it. Others just haven't even thought about it. But really, this paper that I wrote with Kevin, hopefully this will help some of them see actually that there is a conceptually grounded and empirically supported argument to suggest I should actually open my eyes and so on. And
well, that was certainly...
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, certainly. And also, as you suggested, we are in an era now where I think there is an opening, there's an opportunity now. There is a huge dissident community of academics, especially following COVID-19. All of those scientists who got sidelined for saying eminently reasonable things about maybe lockdown isn't such a good idea and so on. There are many of us out there now, both within institutions or outside of institutions or in emeritus positions. And that's an emerging community, which I think, just as independent media has sort of given mainstream media a run for its money, I think that there's a community of dissident academics now which can give mainstream academia a run for its money, and hopefully not put them all out of business, as it were, but actually hopefully get them to really confront these issues, which are the big issues of our time, especially for us in the West. These big issues of how corrupt our political systems have become. So, let's stay hopeful with all of this.
Beautifully said.
One can persuade through rational argumentation.
Absolutely. Brilliant stuff. Okay, well, you answered the questions. Following questions was, I said, are there people in academia who are keeping their head down and agree with you, or are they all not interested in the issue? The second thing is, some of those academic journals that you publish in, do they span a spectrum of some are open to your ideas and some are closed to it and still have this binary idea of conspiracy theory versus the truth? I'll just say, I mean, the editor of The Guardian, who's now editor of Prospect, his name just escapes me for a second. He was the hero back in 2011 when he published a lot of Assange stuff. He seems to think that anything that isn't published by the establishment media, like Prospect and The Guardian and The Telegraph, is fake news. I can't believe he writes that, but it seems to be an honestly held position. He wrote a big essay and got lots of likes on LinkedIn, So my answer
I'll
question
have
is,
a read about it. These people are deluding themselves. I mean,
exactly.
The evidence, even before I sort of became sort of moving into the territory of looking at structural deep events and so on, I was very aware, just looking at sort of analysis of foreign policy and the media, that the evidence showing that the media was basically complicit or deferential to governments, especially in wartime, was overwhelming. And I waded through that literature when I was doing my PhD, and also when I was then researching things such as the CNN effect. And you come up against it time and time again. Well, the evidence is all there, and there's no excuse for not engaging with it. Academia is
Sorry, we've got to wind up there. Piers Robertson, thank you so much. Check out your website, ic911.org, and the essay that we've just been talking about. It's long, but it's well worth a read. Excellent comparison between COVID, and gives you a really good, compact understanding of what really happened at 9/11, with lots of names mentioned and lots of scientific counter evidence to use against those people who haven't been red-pilled yet. Thank you so much, Piers, and happy birthday to you. And you must come on again soon. This is the Pelle and NEROTH Taylor Show on the TNT News Talk. We'll be back after the break.